Henry Grey, 1st Duke of Suffolk, directly turned his biological daughter into a tool for seizing power. He forced Jane Grey to sign a usurpation document to serve factional interests. When royal forces regained control, this noble immediately surrendered and handed his daughter over to the authorities. Queen Mary initially suspended the death sentence for Jane Grey. However, Henry Grey manually voided this leniency by launching a new armed rebellion. That military decision forced the government to behead Jane Grey on February 12, 1554. Exactly 11 days later, the executioner continued to swing the axe to sever the neck of this father himself at the Tower Hill execution ground. This spectacular and devastating familial collapse was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable product of a highly volatile system. The 16th century Tudor court was a dangerous and fast-moving political environment. After King Henry VIII began the English Reformation, royal succession laws were repeatedly rewritten to fit the monarch's changing needs. In this volatile setting, politics and religion were completely tied together. Even a minor disagreement over theology could quickly result in a charge of high treason. The king's favor was absolute and notoriously volatile during this era. A sudden shift in loyalty could elevate a commoner to power or send an old noble family to the executioner's block within weeks. Surviving this system required pragmatism and a sharp eye for changing alliances. Henry Grey held great aristocratic privilege, but he lacked the political skills needed to survive the crises he helped create. Grey's close ties to the English crown were cemented by his bloodline right from birth. He was born around 1517 at the large Bradgate estate in Leicestershire. As the eldest son of Thomas Grey, the second Marquis of Dorset, and Margaret Wotton, he inherited high status immediately. However, his noble birthright alone was not enough to protect him from his own lack of strategic foresight. The Grey family derived its immense status and political leverage from an exclusive historical connection, Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen of King Edward IV. Through her first marriage to Sir John Grey of Groby, she established a direct bloodline that placed the Greys firmly within the extended, intricate web of English royalty. They were not merely wealthy landowners, they were deeply embedded in the genetic architecture of the state. When his father died in 1530, the 13-year-old Henry Grey inherited the title of the third Marquis of Dorset. He also inherited command over a vast territorial power base stretching across the English Midlands. However, as a legal minor, his wardship, the control over his education, his finances, and his eventual marriage fell into the hands of the Crown. The Crown transferred this immensely lucrative wardship to Charles Brandon, the 1st Duke of Suffolk. Charles Brandon was not merely a powerful aristocratic peer, he was King Henry VIII's closest personal friend, his former jousting partner, and, crucially, his brother-in-law. This guardianship placed the young, deeply impressionable Marquis of Dorset directly at the absolute epicenter of Tudor executive power. Aristocratic marriages in the 16th century were entirely devoid of romantic consideration. They functioned as aggressive corporate mergers, designed strictly to consolidate agricultural land, secure military alliances, and expand political influence. Henry Grey was originally formally betrothed to Catherine Fitzalan, the daughter of the formidable Earl of Arundel. However, recognizing the limitations of an alliance with the conservative Fitzalan faction, Grey executed a severe breach of protocol. He abruptly broke the marital contract, inflicting a massive, politically perilous insult upon the Earl of Arundel, an action that would generate fatal consequences decades later. Grey possessed a far more ambitious target for his genetic material. In 1533, operating with the explicit, documented permission of King Henry VIII, the young Marquis married Lady Frances Brandon. Frances was the eldest daughter of his guardian, Charles Brandon, and Mary Tudor, the younger sister of the king and the former Queen of France. This union fundamentally and permanently altered Henry Grey's political trajectory. By marrying Frances, he ceased to be merely a powerful regional lord. He became the king's direct nephew-in-law. The strategic weight of this marriage was codified into constitutional law a decade later. The Third Succession Act of 1543, followed by Henry VIII's final will and testament in 1546, explicitly laid out the legal line of inheritance for the English throne. The king established a strict contingency plan. Should his own direct children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, die without producing legitimate heirs, the English crown would entirely bypass the Scottish royal line, the descendants of his older sister, Margaret, and pass directly to the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor. Frances and Henry Grey were instantly transformed into the custodians of a legitimate, legally sanctioned claim to the absolute power of the English state. They produced 5 children, though only 3 daughters survived infancy: Lady Jane Grey, born 1537, Lady Catherine Grey, born 1540, and Lady Mary Grey, born 1545. Within the ruthless calculus of Tudor politics, these girls were not treated as human children requiring protection. They were classified as dangerously volatile, yet incredibly valuable political assets. Throughout the latter half of Henry VIII's reign, Grey performed the prominent ceremonial duties expected of a top-tier courtier. He was named a Knight of the Bath for the coronation of Queen Anne Boleyn in 1533, granted the honor of carrying the king's sword during the ceremony. He received foreign dignitaries such as Anne of Cleves in 1540, and he commanded English troops during the grueling, financially crippling Siege of Boulogne in 1544. He possessed the refined visual aesthetics and the elite pedigree required of a great lord. However, the death of King Henry VIII in January 1547 immediately exposed the severe limits of his political capability. The accession of the 9-year-old King Edward VI initiated a vicious, high-stakes power struggle among the men who sought to control the minor sovereign and, by extension, the entire machinery of the state. Edward Seymour, the young king's uncle, quickly outmaneuvered his rivals. He seized total control of the government, bypassing the Regency Council established by the late king, and named himself Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset. Henry Grey, despite holding the honor of acting as the chief mourner at Henry VIII's state funeral, found himself completely marginalized by the new Seymour regime. He possessed royal proximity, but he lacked the strategic ruthlessness required to secure a position in the inner circle of the new administration. He was isolated from the center of power while simultaneously facing a severe internal crisis. While this complete political exclusion from the Seymour administration severely marginalized Grey's influence over the young monarch, it simultaneously exposed a far more immediate existential threat to his household. He possessed the highly valuable genetic proximity to the throne through his wife Frances Brandon, but proximity alone could not generate the massive capital required to fund his existence. Lacking a functional conduit to exercise executive power, he could not access state resources. Consequently, this operational isolation rapidly catalyzed a severe, escalating internal crisis, the total and absolute destabilization of the Grey family finances. In the ostentatious, ruthlessly competitive ecosystem of the Tudor aristocracy, political power was inextricably linked to the continuous projection of immense wealth. A marquis was structurally required to maintain multiple sprawling estates, fund a massive retinue of armed retainers and servants, and display extravagant sartorial and architectural aesthetics to signal his status to the crown and his rivals. Henry Grey was fundamentally incapable of managing this economic architecture. Historical financial records indicate that Grey lived vastly beyond the revenue generated by his Midlands estates. His expenditures were reckless, exacerbated by chronic, high-stakes gambling debts accrued at the royal court. By the late 1540s, the Marquis of Dorset was functionally insolvent. He faced a dual threat: complete exclusion from the center of government by the Seymour regime, and the imminent collapse of his financial independence. To solve both his political marginalization and his financial ruin, Grey executed a transaction that would establish a permanent, devastating operational precedent for his future maneuvers. He decided to liquidate his most valuable biological asset. In the 16th century English legal system, the wardship of a minor was an exceptionally lucrative, legally transferable commodity. It granted the purchaser absolute control over the minor's living arrangements, their education, and, critically, the right to dictate their eventual marriage. Henry Grey approached Thomas Seymour, the ambitious, dangerously erratic younger brother of the Lord Protector. Thomas Seymour served as the Lord High Admiral, but he was violently jealous of his older brother's supreme executive authority over the king. Seymour sought to construct his own independent power base to rival the Lord Protector. Grey and Seymour identified a mutual strategic objective. Grey sold the wardship of his eldest daughter, the young Lady Jane Grey, directly to Thomas Seymour for the sum of £2,000, a massive injection of liquid capital that immediately temporarily stabilized Grey's finances. The political strategy underpinning this transaction was straightforward and highly ambitious. Thomas Seymour, leveraging his position as the king's favored uncle, would utilize his direct physical access to the young Edward VI to engineer a royal marriage between the king and Jane Grey. For Henry Grey, this was a ruthlessly calculated geopolitical gamble. If successful, the maneuver would completely bypass the Lord Protector's administrative blockade. By positioning his daughter in the royal bedchamber, Grey would instantly elevate himself to the status of father-in-law to the sovereign, securing absolute proximity to the crown and unhindered access to the royal treasury. Consequently, Jane Grey was physically removed from the Bradgate estate in Leicestershire. She was relocated to Thomas Seymour's household at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, residing alongside his new wife, Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, and the young Princess Elizabeth. Through this transfer, Jane was actively positioned on the chessboard of a high-stakes proxy war between the ambitious brothers. The alliance with Thomas Seymour proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation of operational competence. While Thomas Seymour possessed immense ambition, he entirely lacked the strategic discipline required to successfully execute a quiet political coup. Following the death of his wife, Catherine Parr, in childbirth in 1548, Thomas Seymour's behavior became increasingly erratic and openly treasonous. He attempted to illegally court Princess Elizabeth. He utilized his position as Lord Admiral to engage in outright piracy, actively conspiring with pirate fleets in the English Channel to secure independent funding. He began embezzling state funds from the Bristol Mint to finance a private mercenary army. The climax of his erratic behavior occurred in January 1549. In a desperate, poorly planned maneuver, Thomas Seymour broke into the king's private apartments at Whitehall Palace in the middle of the night, armed with a loaded pistol, allegedly intending to physically kidnap King Edward VI. He shot the king's barking spaniel before being overpowered and arrested by the royal guards. The arrest of the Lord Admiral immediately triggered a massive, relentless state investigation by the Privy Council into his entire network of associates. Henry Grey was summoned for intense interrogation. The discovery of his financial transaction regarding Jane Grey placed him in immediate, severe legal jeopardy. If the Privy Council concluded that Grey was an active co-conspirator in an attempt to subvert the king's marriage and kidnap the sovereign, he would face immediate attainder and execution. However, Grey demonstrated a remarkable capacity for political self-preservation when subjected to direct state pressure. During the interrogations, he successfully deflected responsibility. He portrayed the transfer of Jane to Seymour's household as a standard, innocent educational arrangement, entirely denying any knowledge of Seymour's treasonous military or piratical objectives. The Privy Council, focusing their primary efforts on destroying Thomas Seymour, accepted Grey's defense. Thomas Seymour was executed for high treason on Tower Hill in March 1549. Henry Grey managed to extract his daughter from the compromised household and successfully escaped the scandal without forfeiting his properties or his head. Yet the incident demonstrated a fatal flaw in his methodology. He was entirely willing to attach his family's survival to profoundly unstable, reckless operators in his desperate pursuit of power. The execution of his own brother inflicted fatal political damage upon the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour. His administration was widely viewed by the aristocracy as increasingly tyrannical and simultaneously incompetent. This incompetence was starkly exposed in the summer of 1549, when England erupted into a series of massive domestic rebellions: the Prayer Book Rebellion in the West Country and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk. The Lord Protector was paralyzed by indecision and failed to suppress the uprisings effectively. The vacuum in military leadership was filled by John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. Dudley was an exceptionally competent, ruthless military commander. He mobilized a mercenary force, marched into Norfolk, and systematically annihilated the rebel forces at the Battle of Dussindale. Leveraging his military victory, John Dudley returned to London and orchestrated a flawless political coup. In October 1549, the Privy Council turned against Edward Seymour, arresting him and stripping him of the Lord Protectorship. John Dudley assumed total executive control of the English government, eventually taking the title of Lord President of the Council. Henry Grey observed the collapse of the Seymour regime and immediately executed a calculated factional pivot. Recognizing that John Dudley now controlled the physical body of the king and the machinery of the state, Grey aggressively aligned himself with the new administration. His loyalty was rewarded. Dudley brought Grey into the inner circle, securing his appointment to the Privy Council. Grey finally possessed the administrative access he had sought since the death of Henry VIII. While Grey had secured political proximity, his supreme elevation was ultimately delivered not by political strategy, but by a sudden, devastating biological anomaly. In the summer of 1551, a terrifying epidemic swept through the English aristocracy, the sweating sickness. The exact pathogen responsible for the English sweating sickness remains a subject of modern epidemiological debate, but its manifestation in the 16th century was horrifyingly specific. It was highly contagious, targeted primarily young, affluent males, and killed with unprecedented speed. A victim could be perfectly healthy at dawn and dead from cardiovascular collapse by dusk. The pathogen struck the Brandon household at Buckton Palace in Cambridgeshire. Francis Brandon's two younger half-brothers, Henry Brandon, the 2nd Duke of Suffolk, age 15, and Charles Brandon, the 3rd Duke of Suffolk, age 14, contracted the disease. Despite the immediate deployment of the finest medical personnel available to the elite, the biological deterioration was unstoppable. Both boys died on July 14, 1551, within hours of each other. This tragic biological event altered the architecture of the English nobility. The Brandon male line was completely extinct. The massive territorial wealth, the localized power base in East Anglia, and the prestigious title of the Dukedom of Suffolk immediately reverted to the crown. Henry Grey wasted no time mourning the loss of his young brothers-in-law. He recognized that the extinction of the Brandon male line presented an unprecedented opportunity for supreme aristocratic advancement. Exploiting his wife's genetic position as the eldest surviving female heir of Charles Brandon, Grey aggressively petitioned the Dudley administration. He utilized the legal doctrine of jure uxoris, by right of his wife, demanding that the crown transfer the vacant dukedom of Suffolk directly to him. John Dudley, seeking to permanently bind the powerful Grey faction to his own administration, authorized the transfer. In a meticulously choreographed, synchronized ceremony at Hampton Court Palace in October 1551, the supreme tier of the English nobility was restructured. John Dudley was elevated to become the Duke of Northumberland. Simultaneously, Henry Grey was elevated to become the first Duke of Suffolk in the new creation. With this elevation, Grey reached the absolute pinnacle of the aristocratic hierarchy. He was no longer a regional marquis struggling with debt. He was one of the two most powerful non-royal dukes in the entire kingdom. He commanded vast, unified estates, held a secure seat on the Privy Council, and possessed a daughter who carried the legally sanctioned bloodline of the Tudor succession. Possessing absolute aristocratic security, the newly minted Duke of Suffolk aggressively shifted his focus to his primary ideological obsession, religion. Henry Grey was not a moderate reformer. He was a radical, unyielding Protestant fanatic. He actively corresponded with the leading architects of the Continental Reformation, most notably the Swiss theologian Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich. Grey utilized his supreme authority on the Privy Council to push for the complete, systematic dismantling of any remaining Catholic infrastructure within the English state. He applied this radical theology directly to his own territories. He transformed his estates in Leicestershire into a fortress of extreme reform. He aggressively patronized radical Protestant preachers, sponsored the translation of continental theological texts, and ordered the physical destruction of Catholic altars, stained glass, and traditional vestments within the churches under his jurisdiction. This religious extremism served a dual purpose. Ideologically, it fulfilled his genuine theological convictions. Politically, it bound him inextricably to the administration of John Dudley, who was simultaneously pushing King Edward VI's government toward an increasingly radical Protestant policy. Henry Grey had successfully synchronized his political survival, his aristocratic status, and his religious ideology with the physical existence of the young Protestant king. The entire architecture of his power was completely dependent on Edward VI remaining on the throne. He failed to recognize that by linking his survival entirely to a single, fragile biological entity, he was setting the stage for a catastrophic constitutional crisis when that biology inevitably failed. This meticulously constructed political architecture, built by Grey and John Dudley, relied completely on the physical longevity of the young sovereign to function. By aligning themselves entirely with the radical Protestant faction and systematically dismantling the conservative Catholic infrastructure of the state, the two dukes had deliberately eliminated any possibility of a peaceful transition of power. They had trapped themselves in a rigid system where their physical survival demanded that the king outlive them. In early 1553, that demographic reality violently collapsed. In January 1553, the 15-year-old King Edward VI contracted a severe pulmonary infection, widely identified by modern medical historians as tuberculosis. The biological deterioration of the sovereign was rapid, aggressive, and clearly irreversible. The impending death of the king initiated a catastrophic constitutional crisis for the radical Protestant administration. Under the strict legal parameters established by the Third Succession Act of 1543 and the final will of Henry VIII, the line of succession was unambiguous. If Edward died without a direct heir, the English crown would automatically pass to his older half-sister, Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor was a devout, uncompromising Roman Catholic who had spent her entire life fiercely defending her faith and her mother's, Catherine of Aragon, legacy against the Reformation. She maintained a formidable, hostile intelligence network and had openly defied the Dudley administration's religious edicts. For Henry Grey and John Dudley, the accession of Queen Mary was not merely a political defeat, it was an absolute death sentence. If Mary took the throne, the Protestant Revolution would be violently reversed, the seized monastic lands would be reclaimed, and the men who had orchestrated the radical reforms would face immediate trial, attainder, and the executioner's block for heresy and treason. Driven by the absolute necessity of physical self-preservation and fueled by religious fanaticism, Dudley and Grey initiated a desperate, brazenly illegal conspiracy to completely subvert the constitutional laws of the English state. To prevent Mary Tudor from taking the throne, the administration manipulated the dying king's own fierce Protestant ideology. Edward VI was terrified that his Catholic sister would destroy the Reformed Church of England. Exploiting this fear, Dudley and Grey convinced the king to utilize his royal prerogative to draft a new superseding constitutional document known as the Device for the Succession. The initial drafts of the Device did not name a female monarch. Operating under the strict patriarchal biases of the era, the document originally bequeathed the crown to the hypothetical future heirs male of Francis Brandon, and subsequently to the hypothetical heirs male of Lady Jane Grey. However, the biological timeline defeated this legal strategy. By late May 1553, as the king's physical condition entered its terminal phase, the 16-year-old Jane Grey was still unmarried and entirely childless. The administration did not have years to wait for the production of a male heir. They had weeks. To solve this immediate logistical crisis, the text of the device was manually and illegally altered. The specific phrase detailing the line of succession was scratched out and rewritten. Instead of passing to the Lady Jane's heirs male, the document was aggressively amended to read the Lady Jane and her heirs male. With a single stroke of the pen, Henry Grey's eldest daughter was vaulted over both Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, transitioning from a highly valuable political pawn into the designated immediate heir to the English throne. This constitutional maneuver was a blatant, undeniably public violation of English common law. The legal establishment of the 16th century operated under a strict hierarchy of authority. A monarch's personal letters or executive decrees could not legally override an Act of Parliament, specifically the 1543 Act of Succession. Dudley and Grey recognized that for the coup to possess any semblance of legitimacy, they required the formal endorsement of the kingdom's highest legal officers. On June 11, 1553, the administration summoned the Chief Justices of the realm, including Sir Edward Montague, the Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, to the dying king's bedside at Greenwich Palace. When the royal lawyers reviewed the altered device, they flatly refused to sign it. Montague accurately informed the administration that drafting such a document constituted an undeniable act of high treason under parliamentary law. The refusal of the judiciary triggered an aggressive, physically intimidating reaction from the executive branch. John Dudley exploded into a violent rage. He physically threatened the aging judges, offering to fight them in their shirts, and explicitly threatened them with immediate prosecution for treason if they defied the sovereign's direct command. The king himself berated the justices for their disloyalty. Subjected to severe state intimidation and the threat of physical destruction, the legal establishment capitulated. The judges drafted the formal letters patent to alter the succession. On June 21, the document was presented to the Privy Council and the senior nobility for their signatures. Henry Grey, operating as a primary architect of the usurpation, was among the first to sign the document, permanently committing himself and his family to the treasonous conspiracy. To secure the newly fabricated line of succession and ensure that the executive power remained entirely within their faction, the two dukes recognized that they must forge an immediate, unbreakable biological alliance between their families. Lady Jane Grey, the designated heir, was ordered to marry Guildford Dudley, John Dudley's fourth son. Despite her formidable intellect and fluency in classical languages such as Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, Jane Grey was afforded absolutely no agency in her own fate. She regularly corresponded with the leading theological scholars of Europe, maintaining a fierce devotion to her strict Protestant faith and a razor-sharp understanding of court politics. Consequently, Jane actively abhorred the Dudley family, viewing them as arrogant, spiritually corrupt, and dangerously ambitious. When forced into an arranged marital alliance with this faction, her vehement and categorical refusal to comply was immediately met with the Duke of Suffolk's brutal patriarchal violence. In this specific domestic crisis, Henry Grey deployed extreme physical force to execute his political will. While the authority of a father over his daughter was absolute in the 16th century, the level of abuse inflicted upon Jane was considered shockingly severe, even by the notoriously harsh standards of the Tudor era. Historical records and Jane's own surviving correspondence with the scholar Roger Ascham provide a harrowing forensic detailing of the abuse she endured at the Bradgate estate. She described her existence as a state of perpetual psychological terror. She was subjected to continuous, severe beatings, pinches, nips and bobs, and intense verbal degradation for the absolute slightest perceived infractions of her parents' will. Henry Grey and Frances Brandon systematically broke their daughter's psychological resistance through a coordinated campaign of physical assault and isolation. The Duke of Suffolk did not view his child as a human being requiring protection. He viewed her exclusively as the essential biological key required to unlock his own survival and his ultimate elevation to the throne. On May 25, 1553, a psychologically defeated and physically coerced Jane Grey was transported to Durham House, the massive London residence of John Dudley. She was forced to participate in a highly strategic triple wedding ceremony. Jane was married to Guildford Dudley. Her younger sister Catherine Grey was married to Henry Herbert, the heir to the powerful Earl of Pembroke. Finally, John Dudley's daughter, Catherine Dudley, was married to Lord Hastings. This coldly calculated event was not a celebration of family unions. It was the formal, physical chaining together of the kingdom's most powerful Protestant factions, creating a unified political and military bloc designed to hold the state against the impending Catholic counterattack. Jane Grey was now inextricably bound to a treasonous conspiracy she had actively rejected. The biological foundation of the state finally collapsed on July 6, 1553. King Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace. Recognizing their extreme vulnerability, Dudley and Grey initiated an immediate total information blackout. The death of the sovereign was classified as a top-tier state secret. The administration locked down the capital, closed the ports, and deployed extra military guards to the Tower of London. They required temporal space to physically secure the newly designated queen and, more importantly, to capture Mary Tudor before she could mobilize a counter-coup. The Privy Council dispatched a carefully engineered deceptive summons to Mary, ordering her to attend her dying brother in London. The objective was to draw her directly into a heavily fortified trap and imprison her in the Tower. However, Mary possessed an extraordinarily effective intelligence network of her own. Warned of the ambush by a sympathetic insider, she immediately abandoned her residence at Hunsdon and executed a rapid strategic retreat toward her massive estates in East Anglia to raise a Catholic army. On July 9, 3 days after the king's death, the conspirators initiated the operational phase of the coup. Henry Grey and John Dudley rode to Sion House, a secluded residence on the outskirts of London. They summoned the 16-year-old Jane Grey into a grand stateroom. As the teenager entered, the absolute highest-ranking lords of the English realm, including her father and her father-in-law, knelt before her. They formally informed Jane that King Edward VI was dead, and that by the authority of his final letters patent, she was the rightful Queen of England, France, and Ireland. The psychological shock of the revelation triggered an immediate, severe physical collapse. Jane Grey, already traumatized by months of abuse and deeply terrified of the geopolitical implications, fell to the floor, weeping violently and struggling to draw breath. When she recovered sufficient strength to speak, she executed a definitive theological and legal objection. She pleaded with her father and the assembled council, explicitly stating that the crown rightfully belonged to her cousin, Mary Tudor. She recognized the profound illegality of the usurpation and prayed aloud, begging God for deliverance from the burden. Standing directly over his trembling child, Henry Grey ignored her moral objections. Aided by the intimidating physical presence of the Privy Council, he forced her to accept a crown that was effectively a death sentence. The following day, July 10, 1553, Jane was formally proclaimed Queen in the streets of London. She was transported by a royal barge down the River Thames to the Tower of London. In the Tudor era, the Tower served a dual function. It was the traditional starting point for a monarch's coronation procession, but it also functioned as the ultimate, heavily fortified military command center during periods of state crisis. The procession to the fortress exposed the catastrophic failure of the administration's propaganda machine. As the royal barge moved down the river and the heralds announced the accession of Queen Jane, the citizens of London watched in absolute, hostile silence. There were no cheers, no celebratory bonfires, and no public validation of the coup. The populace viewed the Dudley Grey administration as a corrupt, tyrannical syndicate attempting to steal the rightful inheritance of King Henry VIII's daughter. Inside the massive stone walls of the Tower, Henry Grey and John Dudley prepared to govern the realm. They had successfully seized the capital, controlled the treasury, and possessed the physical body of the designated monarch. However, their strategic position was fundamentally compromised. Mary Tudor was not in custody. She was actively raising a massive, ferociously motivated military force in the east. The administration required a general to march out and annihilate the legitimate heir, a tactical necessity that would ultimately trigger the total destruction of Henry Grey's family. The relocation of the newly proclaimed Queen Jane to the highly fortified Tower of London on July 10, 1553, provided the Dudley Grey administration with a powerful visual symbol of state control, but it masked a catastrophic, rapidly deteriorating geopolitical reality. The conspirators had seized the physical capital, but they had fundamentally miscalculated the strategic capability and the popular support of their primary target, Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor did not surrender to the usurpation. Utilizing a highly effective intelligence network that had penetrated the Privy Council, she anticipated the coup before King Edward VI had even stopped breathing. Evading the cavalry dispatched to capture her, Mary executed a brilliant, rapid strategic retreat deep into the conservative heartland of East Anglia. She established her command center at the massive, heavily fortified Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. Operating with the absolute conviction of her divine right to rule, Mary did not merely hide, she issued a royal summons. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The provincial nobility, the gentry, and tens of thousands of commoners rallied to her standard. They were driven not exclusively by Catholic fervor, but by a deeply ingrained respect for the Tudor bloodline and the 1543 Act of Succession. They viewed the Dudley Grey faction as an illegitimate, tyrannical syndicate attempting to steal the crown. Within days, Mary had assembled a massive, ferociously motivated military force that vastly outnumbered the standing royal guard in London. The Dudley Grey administration was no longer managing a clean political transition. They were facing a full-scale, heavily armed civil war. The Privy Council, barricaded within the Tower of London, panicked as intelligence reports detailed the massive scale of Mary's army. They required an immediate military intervention to march out of the capital, engage Mary's forces in East Anglia, and annihilate the legitimate heir before her army could reach the gates of London. A severe crisis of command immediately emerged. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, was the most capable, battle-hardened military commander in the kingdom. However, Dudley was terrified to leave London. He recognized that the loyalty of the Privy Council was highly fragile. If he removed his intimidating physical presence from the Tower, the conservative lords would likely defect to Mary. Consequently, the council initially appointed Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk, to command the expeditionary force. It was at this precise, critical juncture that Lady Jane Grey intervened, inadvertently sealing the fate of her own regime. Jane possessed a highly acute understanding of her father's capabilities. She knew that Henry Grey, despite his martial posturing, lacked the strategic intelligence and the ruthless battlefield discipline required to defeat a massive insurgency. Furthermore, she was terrified for his physical safety. Operating in a state of high emotional distress, the newly proclaimed queen broke down in tears before the assembled Privy Council. She utilized her sovereign authority to explicitly beg the councillors to allow her father to remain safely with her inside the Tower of London, arguing she needed his counsel. Yielding to the distressed, weeping teenager, John Dudley made the most fatal tactical error of his entire career. He agreed to take command of the army himself. On July 14, Dudley rode out of London at the head of an artillery and cavalry force, leaving Henry Grey in sole command of the Tower of London and the highly volatile Privy Council. The moment John Dudley and his loyalist troops crossed the perimeter of the capital, the operational dynamic within London fundamentally shifted. With Northumberland's departure, the command of the Tower and the ultimate survival of the usurpation fell squarely onto Suffolk's shoulders. He was tasked with maintaining the political integrity of the coup and managing the highly volatile Privy Council. It was a critical leadership position he was entirely ill-equipped to hold, and he proved immediately catastrophically incompetent. The military situation rapidly deteriorated. The English naval fleet, which had been dispatched to the eastern coast to blockade Mary's forces and cut off her potential escape routes to the continent, executed a mass mutiny. The sailors declared their absolute allegiance to Mary Tudor and surrendered their heavy artillery directly to her commanders. Simultaneously, Dudley's advancing army began to hemorrhage troops. His soldiers, recognizing the overwhelming numerical superiority of Mary's forces and sensing the shifting political winds, deserted in massive numbers. Dudley was forced to halt his advance at Cambridge, effectively paralyzed. Inside the Tower of London, the seasoned, ruthlessly pragmatic politicians of the Privy Council, specifically conservative power brokers like the Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Arundel, analyzed the incoming intelligence. They executed a cold, objective political calculus. The coup was doomed. If they remained aligned with Jane Grey, they would be executed for high treason the moment Mary's army breached the city walls. They required an immediate exit strategy to abandon the fortress, officially switch sides, and secure pardons from Mary. However, to execute this defection, they had to bypass Henry Grey, who controlled the physical gates of the Tower. The councillors deployed a transparent, shockingly simplistic deception. They approached Grey and informed him that they urgently needed to leave the secure perimeter of the Tower grounds to consult with the French ambassador and raise additional mercenary troops for the defense of the capital. Displaying an astonishing, almost incomprehensible lack of political awareness, Grey believed them. He failed to recognize that seasoned politicians do not leave a fortified command center during an active coup unless they are fleeing. Operating with absolute naivety, the Duke of Suffolk ordered the heavy iron gates of the Tower of London to be opened. He allowed the entire executive apparatus of the English government to simply walk free. On July 19, the defecting councillors converged at Baynard's Castle, the massive London residence of the Earl of Pembroke. They immediately summoned the Lord Mayor of London and the city aldermen. In a carefully staged public ceremony, the Earl of Arundel formally denounced the usurpation of the Dudley-Grey faction. The council officially proclaimed Mary I as the rightful, undisputed Queen of England. The citizens of London, who had watched Jane Grey's arrival in dead silence 9 days prior, erupted into massive, overwhelming celebrations. The streets were filled with cheering crowds, bonfires were lit, and church bells rang continuously across the capital. When the deafening sound of the celebrations and the intelligence of the council's defection reached the Tower later that afternoon, Henry Grey realized that his entire political architecture had collapsed. His army was gone, his closest allies had defected, and his life was immediately forfeit. His reaction to the total failure of the coup was immediate, visceral, and utterly devoid of paternal loyalty. Grey did not attempt to mount a defense of the fortress, nor did he seek to formulate an escape plan for his daughter. He walked directly into the royal state apartments, where the 16-year-old Jane was sitting alone. Bypassing his daughter entirely, Grey reached up and physically tore down the canopy of state. The canopy was the ultimate physical manifestation of sovereign authority in the Tudor court. Tearing it down was an aggressive, undeniable act of deposition. Grey turned to the teenager he had physically beaten and psychologically terrorized into accepting the crown just 9 days earlier. He bluntly informed her that her reign was over, stating that she must now return to her status as a private citizen. Grey then abandoned her entirely to her fate. He ordered his remaining guards to open the Tower gates. Driven by an absolute, desperate cowardice, the Duke of Suffolk rode out to Tower Hill, stood before the crowds, and publicly shouted his allegiance to Queen Mary. He attempted to blend into the winning faction, leaving his teenage daughter isolated inside the fortress, which transitioned in a matter of seconds from her royal palace to her maximum security prison. Henry Grey's attempt to save himself through immediate public submission was structurally futile. He was arrested within hours by the Queen's agents and briefly confined within the Tower. John Dudley was similarly arrested in Cambridge, brought back to London under heavy guard, and thrown into the dungeons. However, Grey possessed one final, immensely valuable political card that Dudley lacked: his wife. Frances Brandon, the Duchess of Suffolk, was Queen Mary's direct first cousin. Frances executed a brilliant, precision-targeted diplomatic strike. Leaving the capital, she rode relentlessly to intercept Queen Mary's advancing entourage. Throwing herself upon the physical mercy of her cousin, Frances weaponized 16th-century gender norms to construct a legally viable defense for her husband. Weeping profusely, she constructed a narrative that entirely absolved Henry Grey of strategic responsibility. She blamed the entire treasonous usurpation squarely on the ambition of John Dudley. She convinced Mary that Henry Grey was not a mastermind, but a weak-willed, easily manipulated fool who had been physically coerced and deceived by the Duke of Northumberland. She argued that executing an incompetent peer would serve no political purpose. Against all standard political and legal logic of the Tudor era, Queen Mary believed the narrative. Mary was naturally inclined toward mercy in the earliest days of her reign and harbored a genuine familial affection for Francis. After exactly 3 days of imprisonment, Henry Grey was granted a full unconditional royal pardon. The administration released him from the Tower without levying a single fine, and his massive Midlands estates were left entirely intact. However, to secure this pardon, the radical Protestant Duke was forced to execute a complete, humiliatingly public theological surrender. The man who had aggressively corresponded with Heinrich Bullinger and dismantled the Catholic infrastructure of Leicestershire was compelled to publicly renounce his Reformed faith. Grey attended Catholic Mass, knelt before the altar, and took the Catholic Eucharist, demonstrating an absolute willingness to trade his eternal soul for his physical survival. While Henry Grey walked free, the political reality for his daughter was catastrophic. Lady Jane Grey was not included in the pardon. She remained locked inside the secure perimeter of the Tower. In August 1553, John Dudley was tried, convicted, and beheaded on Tower Hill. In November, Jane Grey was escorted under heavy guard to the Guildhall in London. She was subjected to a heavily publicized state trial, officially convicted of high treason against the sovereign, and returned to the Tower under a formal sentence of death. However, Queen Mary recognized that Jane had been a pawn in the machinations of the men around her. The Queen utilized her royal prerogative to suspend the execution of the sentence. Jane Grey was now effectively a biological hostage of the English state. She was kept alive exclusively by the Queen's mercy. Her continued survival and the suspension of the executioner's acts was completely, inextricably dependent on one absolute condition. Her father, Henry Grey, must remain strictly, flawlessly obedient and absolutely loyal to the Catholic regime of Queen Mary. The life of the teenage girl hung by a single, perilously thin thread, entirely reliant on the political discipline of a man who had already proven he possessed none. By the end of 1553, Queen Mary announced her formal intention to marry King Philip of Spain. The prospect of foreign Catholic domination generated immediate, intense hostility among the English public. Simon Renard, the imperial ambassador representing Spanish interests, accurately identified Lady Jane Grey as a continuous security risk. He repeatedly warned Mary that Jane served as a living figurehead for Protestant dissidents and demanded her execution. Mary refused, initially sparing the teenager. At this critical juncture, Henry Grey made a decision entirely devoid of political logic and parental duty. With his daughter imprisoned in the Tower as a condemned hostage, her survival contingent on his absolute loyalty, Grey chose to join a massive coordinated armed uprising known as Wyatt's Rebellion. The conspiracy was designed as a four-pronged military assault on London to depose Mary and prevent the Spanish alliance. Grey was assigned to raise a rebel army in Leicestershire and the Midlands. He knew with absolute certainty that any treasonous action would trigger the immediate execution of his daughter. Prioritizing his religious extremism over his child's life, he rebelled anyway. On January 25, 1554, the Privy Council, suspecting his involvement, summoned Grey to court. Panicking, Grey fled his residence at Sheen. He dispatched a servant to the council claiming severe illness, then mounted a horse with his brothers, John and Thomas, riding relentlessly toward Bradgate. His attempt to mobilize an army was an abysmal failure. The local gentry, disgusted by his previous usurpation attempt and terrified of Mary's authority, flatly refused to support him. Grey managed to assemble a force of only 140 cavalrymen. Desperate, he marched on the city of Coventry to seize its armory. Forewarned by the Crown, the mayor of Coventry locked the city gates and prepared for a siege. Queen Mary dispatched a highly mobile cavalry force commanded by the Earl of Huntingdon to intercept the Duke. Realizing he was hopelessly outmatched, Grey abandoned his men. He ordered his tiny force to scatter and fled into the freezing countryside. In early February, a starving Duke of Suffolk arrived at Astley Park in Warwickshire. He sought refuge with a groundskeeper named Underwood, a man who had lived under Grey's patronage for years. Underwood agreed to hide him, leading Grey to a massive hollowed-out oak tree deep in the woods. For 2 days and nights, the former Lord High Constable of England hid inside the tree trunk, enduring freezing winter temperatures. Faced with a massive financial reward and the threat of Huntingdon's interrogators, Underwood made a pragmatic calculation. He sold his master to the crown. Underwood led the Queen's men directly to the oak tree. Henry Grey was dragged out of the hollow trunk, humiliated and stripped of his weapons. On February 10, he was transported back to London and locked in the Tower. Grey's armed rebellion provided Ambassador Renard with the absolute leverage he required. He issued a blunt diplomatic ultimatum. Prince Philip would not travel to England while Jane Grey remained alive. The rebellion proved the girl was a permanent active security threat. Stripped of any political justification for mercy, Mary signed the death warrants. The consequences of Henry Grey's ambition culminated on the morning of February 12, 1554. Looking out from her window in the Tower, Lady Jane Grey watched the headless corpse of her young husband, Guildford Dudley, returned in a cart from the public scaffold. Moments later, the 16-year-old was led to a private scaffold erected on Tower Green. Maintaining strict composure, she addressed the small crowd. She claimed legal responsibility for accepting the crown, but maintained her innocence in actively seeking it. She tied a white handkerchief around her eyes. Suddenly plunged into darkness, she lost her physical orientation on the scaffold. Reaching her hands into the empty air, she panicked, crying out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander stepped forward, guiding her hands to the wooden block. She laid her head down, and with a single strike of the axe, her life was terminated. 5 days later, on February 17, Henry Grey was brought to Westminster Hall. He was tried by a court of his peers, presided over by the Earl of Arundel, one of the very men who had defected from him during the July coup. The evidence of his armed rebellion was indisputable. He was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to death at 9 a.m. On February 23, 1554, Henry Grey was escorted up Tower Hill to the public execution block. In his final moments, he demonstrated a steady resolve that had entirely eluded him in life. He stood before the crowd, acknowledged his crimes against the Queen, and accepted his sentence. However, he refused to compromise his theology. Reversing his forced conversion of the previous summer, he loudly proclaimed that he died a true Reformed Protestant. He forgave the executioner, handed out coins, and knelt in the straw. Tying his own blindfold, he recited a final prayer and placed his head on the block. The axe fell, ending the life of the 37-year-old Duke. His headless body was buried beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower. The destruction of his family was absolute. Parliament passed an Act of Attainder, officially erasing the Grey family's legal existence. Their vast Midlands estates and wealth were permanently seized by the Crown. Frances Brandon quickly married Adrian Stokes, her master of the horse, a man of such low social standing that the union proved she harbored no further royal ambitions. The two surviving daughters, Catherine and Mary, spent the rest of their lives as political liabilities, enduring decades of imprisonment and surveillance under the subsequent reign of Elizabeth I. The political narrative of Henry Grey ended in 1554, though a macabre epilogue followed his remains. In 1851, a mummified head severed by a heavy blade was discovered in the Holy Trinity Church vault in London. Some historians theorize that Frances Brandon smuggled her husband's head to prevent its public display on London Bridge, and it was naturally preserved by the high levels of tannin in the executioner's oak sawdust. While a competing theory suggests the head was merely a byproduct of 18th-century grave robbing, anatomical comparisons to Grey's contemporary portraits supported the identification. Regardless of its true origin, the relic remained a morbid curiosity until church authorities finally ended the spectacle, quietly transporting the head to a churchyard for a permanent, dignified burial in 1990. Henry Grey possessed every structural tool required to secure a lasting dynasty: royal blood, unimaginable wealth, and proximity to the center of Tudor power. Yet he systematically dismantled his own legacy through a fatal combination of extreme arrogance and fundamental cowardice. In his relentless, incompetent pursuit of power, Henry Grey succeeded only in transforming his ancient family name into a permanent historical synonym for political failure and parental betrayal.